Welcome our 4 different committees to our Saturday workshop. It's fantastic to have us all together on some issues that do relate to the entire town, but to each of the committees. This is certainly a first during the time I've been here. I've never heard of it happening. We have all the committees working together. Our agenda is extensive. We hope to get out of here by 11 or 11:30, so we'll be concise and quick, but we'll try to hit on things as best we can. Our first item, Ms. Moran.
May I just add to that? Part of the Selectmen's strategic plan this year is communication. So, this is, kind of an obvious but much needed example of that. So I just want to add my appreciation to everyone who's here.
And since this is a joint meeting of all 4, do either any of the other 3 chairs want to say anything or at least call a meeting to order for the purposes of their committees?
Joint meeting.
Well, so I'll call the meeting of the planning board.
I'll call the meeting of the zoning board.
Great, we have enough lawyers in here to make sure we're doing this correctly.
It's the last thing.
Right.
So the first topic is on the continuing discussion on resiliency, and specifically coastal resiliency, as part of our local comprehensive plan, and really trying to come up with what do we do now? We know it's an issue out there. We have the hazard mitigation plan that's been presented, which is a larger spectrum document, but what do we do now? How do we proceed? And this is the start of it. So.
Okay, I'm going to jump right in because I don't know how many of you know, but the Conservation Commission and the Planning Board have a very, very small subcommittee whose responsibility it is to forward this, the goals of this document. And what we decided when we met once is that we could probably not do much further until the study was done, that I did see in the newspaper that you're going to be going after CZM funds. The group that we had speak to us thought that there might be sufficient free funds that we could get started immediately on it. But until we know definitively what the vulnerable areas are in Falmouth, how vulnerable they are, what magnitude of storm makes them vulnerable, and have some idea, recommendations as to what we might do, it would be very difficult for us to move forward with anything on coastal resiliency without potentially making some mistakes along the way and thereby wasting money for the town. So that is paramount, that study be done. Now, we spoke with one group and there was a grumbling about, well, how come they always get it? There are other groups who have this capability too. But this particular group has done studies in the Boston area and along the coastline here, and they're very familiar. So would waste probably less time, as another company might, with familiarizing themselves with the forces that we're dealing with. I'm not advocating for them. I'm saying that there are other options, and the town should go out probably for bids on it before that ever happens. But there is something that can start. I believe that the Board of Selectmen, the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission and the DPW can look at a site called Rebuild by Design, and you will see that as the second bulleted idea as to where we need to go for the future. There's a lot of interesting information on that site as to what can possibly be done. One of which that we have extensively spoken about, both for the Planning Board and in our small subcommittee that's been doing the local comprehensive plan. Bob could speak to that probably fairly extensively because his hometown essentially did that many, many years ago. And that is to build an artificial reef off the shore. Obviously, I'm not an engineer. I don't know how far off. I don't know the tidal forces or anything like that. But when you build an artificial reef, it allows sand to come in and repopulate that area. As you know, Doug, you said that probably 10 years from now, Surf Drive won't be here. It'll be washed away. You said that probably 2 years ago when we first started talking about resiliency. If we did something like that, that would allow the sand to come in and start rebuilding those beaches. I believe, but again, you'd have to have an engineering firm that is cognizant of this capacity that might happen. That would protect our sewer line that goes under the bike path. As you know, it's gotten into trouble more than once. That would protect our beaches along Surf Drive that are washing away. Now, one of the major reasons to bring this up right now is that that is also going to take a financial commitment of the town to do so. Again, I have no idea how much, whether the town would decide to do it, whether it would decide to do it in stages, and if so, what the stages are that would be most beneficial for the town. So I throw this out because a lot of this is selectman decision. If it's going to be very expensive, which it most likely will, that also means that, we might have to do a tax increase, or we might have to do something else that would set aside amount of money to be able to accomplish that. But I would encourage everybody here to look at that particular site and rebuild by design and see what the options are for protecting our coastline.
And if we were just protecting it from storm surge, I could see how but we also may have sea rise of 10 feet, which nothing's
Right.
going to stop it.
Correct.
And to put the finances into building a reef, and the water just comes right up it and rises over it, is the reason why that kind of study. One concern I have about the study is, we also had one done about 10 or 15 years ago by a whole bunch of, we had a local working group who came up with recommendations, and we may need to first decide what do we do about those recommendations, or are we just saying we're not using that study and we're just moving forward with a different one?
Then I would also suggest, and I brought this up when we had the discussion with the Historical Commission this past week, that what happens is that beautiful studies are done and they take up nice shelf space because you've got no one championing them who is going to be heard. You've got people who change. Your Board of Selectmen is pretty new. It doesn't go back in time. Our planning board, all pretty new except me. I'm ancient. And that's sort of sad when you think about it, because the institutional memory is disappearing. When the institutional memory disappears, 10 years ago, think about, were any of you on the board 10 years ago? No.
About 6.
Okay? So think about the institutional memory. Where in that stack of beautiful old studies does that coastal study reside? And who's looking at it for recommendations? I know one of the major ones was to remove, and excuse me because I don't know the terminology along the shoreline, but the groins and the, whatever else they're called, these jetties, thank you. Okay, I'm not a marine sort of person, but that was one of the major recommendations from that study that I do recall, and that was to remove all of those. They were built there to protect the beaches, but in fact, they've added to the decrease of the beaches. And it was Jude Wilbur who was very instrumental in that study, whose place I took on the planning board.
I'm going to disagree vehemently about the ancient term. But in terms of your, kind of putting together your idea, and I see Mike Galasso, the chair of the EDIC, in the room. One of the things that could be looked at, because, in terms of making such a huge investment, and, what that would mean to, adding the, the cost to our residents of living here. There are studies that could be done in terms of, I know Wellfleet is doing a similar study to what you're talking about, but I'm wondering if we could, if we eventually, if we do decide to do an RFP, that something could be looked at that has an economic development component. For example, the West Coast has a lot of, shore attractions that get included, which would, I think, be a lifestyle attraction to Falmouth, which, always has potential for supporting employment. So there are certain things that could be looked at where maybe we're getting, a bigger bang for the buck. And then in terms of your comment on the studies that sit on the shelves, Heather Harper right now, I'm going to be on one of the housing strategy discussions, which actually includes an element of looking at studies that have been done and looking at the implementation. So that last step that you're talking about, when we invest in a study and it sits on the shelf, that's recognized as being, is not completing the job. So, I think it goes, it affects a lot of issues, but, we are looking at the implementation side now finally, so you're right on there. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I've read those studies, so I'm trying to carry on that institutional memory, and I would point out that the methodologies, or at least the processes that are pointed out in that study, basically looked at natural processes.
Right.
Now this artificial reef is a very different approach, and I would love to get those scientists that actually participate in that study here to talk about what they would anticipate to be the ramifications of taking an approach like that, because I'm a little worried whenever we insert an artificial technique in that we don't understand all the consequences of, especially if it's not been done before. I hope the experience that Bob's Native community is going through would be something we could learn from. But one of the things that they mention out in those coastal management studies that were done is that that sand needs to come from somewhere because the erosion is constantly taking it away. And the problem is that we've protected those very banks that were the source of the sand to replace the stuff that's leaving, and we're keeping that sand from going west. But guess what? There's some expensive properties that are on the top of those banks. So there's a complicated social, economical piece of this that isn't necessarily going to be solved easily. And maybe we, for social and political reasons, we won't be able to solve it. But it's part of the discussion, and I certainly would love to take a look at the artificial reef concept, but very carefully.
I just want to agree with Sam. Being a coastal scientist, Mother Nature is going to win out no matter what happens. And I think Doug brought up a good point. When you're talking about putting an artificial, this is done. I don't know about Rob's community, but this has been done at various places down the East Coast. And any artificial engineering of any kind is going to have some negative consequences. So that's one point. The other point I want to make is, I understand sort of people's frustration with having studies done and then whether things get implemented or not. But I do want to point out, I believe there are a lot of things we can do in town that we already know about that can help with coastal resiliency. And I think some of them you've articulated here. I know Jen and I were with the planning when you put this together. Jen and I tend to be, we're like, well, kind of those ideas are sort of vague. What exactly is it they want to do? But I think we're at the point where we could take some of this and implement some of the things that were suggested here. I mean, really have action items. So, there are two ways to look at things. One is wait until we have all the studies and we have the buy-in from the whole town to know exactly what we want to do. And that's okay. It's okay to go that route. But meanwhile, there are a lot of other things that we know can help. And let's start some
I think
of
this is what
those.
Pat's point is. So who's going to take the ownership of it? And I think you should suggest the Board of Selectmen, Mike. I would rather have it be a group that's made up of these different four committees, because for the Board of Selectmen to do it without direct input either from the Conservation Commission or the Planning Board isn't really, I think, appropriate, because we need information from those two different groups, and also from the Zoning Board of Appeals, because the effects of decisions we make, with some of the more expensive houses that are, may be affected by this, that's why I'd say, okay, let's create who is going to be in charge of implementing some of these action items and moving forward and make sure it actually gets done. Doug Brown?
I think that we're going to be, the selectmen are going to be responsible for keeping it moving forward as far as directing contracts and so forth. So we're going to have to take the ultimate responsibility to keep it moving. And I think time is of the essence. If you look at these grants that have been awarded over the last few years, Coastal Zone Management, they gave out $2 million in 2014, 2.4 in 2015, 2.7 in 2016, and last year there was only 1.8. So maybe it's starting to trend downward, I don't know. I hope that's just a one-year thing, but we're way behind. We haven't been getting any of these, and all the other towns here that are listed are getting quite a bit of money. I don't think it would be limited just to the engineering. I think that there may be other help for us beyond the engineering. If you look in the Coastal Zone website on the grant application, it specifically looks for communities that have infrastructure at risk along the coast, and we're a perfect example of that with Surf Drive. So personally, I have my own pie-in-the-sky idea. I would love to see us consider the same kind of sheet piles that they use at the Minot Bridge to protect the sewer line in the most vulnerable area. And I would have this crazy idea that we'd like to put some kind of a reef, whether it's artificial oyster beds or concrete. I got this concrete book here, it's got these interlocking blocks. We could start at Knobscut and go maybe close to the mouth of Falmouth Harbor. This is just my idea. Maybe it'd be a breakwater that would be somewhat submerged, but would stop the wave action a little bit. And I agree, that old study about removing the jetties, it was completely ignored. And so we have to take action on that, because I think that's an important thing. All the sand moves from south to east, southeast to westward, I should say. And you're right, we've lost Knobscut now, it's all armored, there's no more sand coming from that area. So it seems to me eventually we're going to have to replenish in the Trunk River area through beach nourishment, and it's going to move across the east if we remove those groins, and we'll be more back to a natural setting, but we're going to have to do some artificial beach nourishment, in my opinion. So I think time is of the essence and we're way behind.
Megan?
I would just say that I think that the problem is less the loss of the institutional memory and more that these types of meetings haven't happened, because that's really, you have a study and then because that study sort of implicates different boards or committees, and there hasn't been this coming together really in this way, I think it's, you know, it's that passing the buck, and I don't mean that in a bad way for any, it's nobody's really sure, are we the one who's, you know, who's taking the lead and how does that implicate things? And so I think, you know, this is a problem that is of a magnitude that is far greater. I mean, issues about coastal resiliency are far greater than many other problems that the community has faced, and the implications are really significant and long-term. So I think, you know, the idea that this type of collaboration has to happen, it can't be, you know, it can't be overstated that to address a problem of that nature, all of these and other, you know, departments and committees that aren't here today are going to have to be involved in whatever, you know, study or plan we put in place. I think where it's really fallen down is that there hasn't been this the type of collaboration and coming together, and that is, it's problematic, and not just because, you know, you might duplicate a study here or there, but because the town and the community, they're not getting the, you know, we're not moving forward, as Doug is saying, you know, I think we're a little bit behind the 8 ball on a problem that is significant. So I just hope that this becomes, I would just like to echo the sentiment that this becomes something that is happening, whether it's quarterly or however it happens, or if there's a subgroup, or sometimes subgroups, you know, we have too many subgroups. Sometimes it's nice to get everyone in a room together. But I hope that this continues, because I think it has to if we're really going to do anything on this particular issue. So.
I will just say very quickly that in my prior life, in my prior town, our town boards met at least quarterly, because that's the only way the interchange of information works. And, you know, here, it just seems everything is just sort of parallel, but there's no intersection. So I'm just thrilled that this meeting is taking place. My other comment is, we are not the only community down the coast. Environmental Protection Agency has been doing a lot of work, and maybe some of the science hasn't been redacted yet, but probably most of it has. But there are studies that had been going on, well, I mean, I retired a year and a half ago, but about coastal resiliency. And clearly, Boston was looking at what happens if there's a storm surge, like what happened in New York, and what happens to the infrastructure in the city of Boston with flooding. And so here we're looking more at businesses and homes, but we have to be sort of coordinated with the rest of the East Coast, because it's not going to just hit Falmouth, you know. I mean, it's just so interesting to me, because as I look, Falmouth has this little protective entity because of Buzzards Bay that other parts of the East Coast don't have. So I think how we go ahead with what happens with a surge different from Buzzards Bay to Nantucket Sound. But there are studies there, and Boston, as I said, the EPA, all the way up and down, and including Canada, because we had conference calls with Canada. I think there's a huge amount of information that we could avail ourselves of and not recreate the wheel, certainly.
Tim?
Maybe just quickly, I think we need to see this as a 50-year plan, because 50 years from now, things are going to be even more different. With sea level rise, it'll be an entirely different dynamic. And so I think we need to really think in terms of, let's make the investment that's going to be for a duration of a reasonable period of time, knowing full well that that investment may be worth very little at that point. But I think we need to recognize that we're dealing with such a geological change in sea level rise, and we just have to accept that. You know, this is going to be a change that we're going to make that's going to try to preserve the economic vitality of the community for a period of time. And then after that, people are going to have to step up and look again and see whether there's something else that can help control our destiny. And I think that's what this is all about, is how can we manage the change that's going to occur in the most prudent way that we can, given the information that we know.
The point I wanted to make is what we talked about, the infrastructure, is all these points connected. What Falmouth is unique in the fact that it has waterfront access starting in the east side, and you can come to Falmouth and drive the coastline and see it. When people think of Falmouth, it's the beautiful beaches and connections we have. You know, in the 80s, we totally redesigned Minot Beach, okay? They moved the channel from one side to the other. We've done all kinds of this work, and, you know, I think if you take the point, well, 50 years from now, that it's going to be 10 feet higher, we can't do anything. Well, during those 50 years, we're going to have people living here. We're going to have to get back and forth to the east and west. I want access to the beaches. I don't want our town to become isolated and just have little pockets. I mean, I think that what makes Falmouth great is the access to the waterfront and the views you see as you travel around our town. And every little neighborhood has its own little beach they can get to. And that's really what our town is. And it's not just Surf Drive, it's just not Minot, it's the whole system. And you can either take the opinion, well, it's all over, let's walk away 50 years and we're not going to do anything, or we fight like hell to keep it for as long as we can. And I think that's the point we're trying to make. We realize, we know that the sea level's rising, but I plan to be here for some of those years. I remember in the 80s doing Minot Beach, and that was a pretty massive redesign of coastline. I don't know if any of you guys remember it, but it was a project that Andy Dufresne did. They moved the channel hundreds of feet, redid the road, moved the road back. They preserved that connection for 30 years. And that's what we're talking about, not giving up and say walk away. Just fight it and keep it together. And that's why we need some studies to help us help make those decisions where the best place to do it is.
I would just like to make, for me, a final comment, maybe.
We won't hold you to that.
Okay. I was involved with the local comprehensive plan since my notes go back to 2009. And there were probably 2 or 3 stumble starts during that period of time. We had a lot of public participation with Ewell, out of West Ewell, being the moderator. Okay, we got nice public participation for 3 different things there. Energy, wetlands, and there was a third one. I think it was land open land. And then, we didn't hit anybody's tickle button anymore, so nobody showed up at the next one. So we had good participation then, and it just kind of dissolved. We had being driven by energy for a period of time, and then we took care of that, so it dissolved. It wasn't until the planning board was appointed to be the chief agent to do the local comprehensive plan, and the 3-member subcommittee was appointed. And Marlene McCullough was instrumental in bringing us all together, giving us information, and working with us very diligently that we actually did something. And it has been probably 4 years, I think. Is that about right, Bob? 4 years? And we today have the final product. That is why I'm bringing up right now that, okay, this discussion is wonderful, and yes, it would be absolutely fabulous if we did this on a quarterly basis. I love what's happening today. But to make it happen for coastal resiliency, you are going to need a subcommittee, and I recognize that there are too many committees. But it's got to happen or nothing will happen on coastal resiliency, and I just submit that. And because my job is done with the local comprehensive plan, I would volunteer to do that. But I don't know about the selectmen, and I don't know about the Concom. And I think this has got to be put together sooner rather than later and start working on it.
That's a good work on that.
I've heard a number of final products here, this final product, that final product. I haven't seen any of those final products. And so I have 2 suggestions. One is, it would, and I realize that this is an ongoing thing in town. I don't know what stage it's at, but it would be nice if we had a website where we could actually go.
You can get that, you can get the, well, but I know it's not easy to navigate it sometimes, but it is there, it's there.
It's not organized to pull it all together. I think that's what Betsy's
Yeah.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
click on
'cause
each.
I think there are a lot, yeah. I mean, you probably have to go through planning and.
Yep.
And you have to look
Not
at
that I
each
don't,
separate
not that I
chapter.
don't want to
You
go
do,
to the
but try to
planning
find
section.
We need a search button.
Yeah, yeah. If you could easily access each one of these things.
Bob?
I know beach nourishment isn't a real popular option because people say you pump all the sand up and it just washes away. But it's a low-tech, short-term solution. It's something that has to be continually maintained. You go along the coast of New Jersey, you go along the Carolinas, it's a continual effort. They're constantly pumping sand because the sand on the beaches, where does it go? It goes out into the water. I can tell you that from out here. When the shoals change every winter. The example of the canal, the end of the canal got pumped up onto the sandwich beaches, and then we had the big storm, wiped all the sand out. Well, if that sand wasn't there would have been a lot more damage to personal property and government property as well. So, I mean, it can help. It's a short-term solution. When we went to school on Hurricane Sandy, those towns that had dunes that they maintained versus the ones that had man-made abutments and reverts and all that kind of stuff, they sustained the heavy damage. The natural dune communities, the ones that kept maintaining them, no damage whatsoever to a lot of those properties.
So maybe the right investment is we get our own dredge.
I've been saying
That might be
that.
the-
I've been saying that for
We're
years.
a coastal community.
But actually, Bob brought up a perfect example of natural processes. If the Army Corps didn't have a giant groin at the mouth of the canal, if you look at the beach on the other side, it's built out a long way. That's where all the sand that is supposed to be on the beach in Sandwich. So you have to be careful of these unintended consequences. And you're right, I mean, our whole coast is a system. Things we do here potentially could affect Mashpee or Bourne.
Mark?
So I'm hearing, being the newest member of the planning board and reviewing, I think it was in June, the planning board and Concom got together and talked about this very subject. I'm hearing things about building. One of the things that I bring to the table here from that old meeting is not building. And I think Mr. Leary was the one that broached it at the last meeting with concerns, to piggyback on Sam and Mr. Bird specifically and Bob, about 50 years down the road. And so the final product in part that we do have that I would suggest to everybody to review and look at is that multi-hazard plan that was just completed and up in draft form and up for public comment. But that being said, one of the strong points made at that last year's meeting was Chatham's conservancy bylaw and conservancy districts. So given that being on the table on that side of the Cape, and now with this this final product in part that gives significant information, I'm just putting it out there, is there application of that for Falmouth? In the sense of, instead of building something, perhaps it might be, in a long-range view, time to stop building stuff. To safeguard, property and
We don't have the access that Jim wants, but.
I like the idea of natural wetland buffers, dune systems. I think we have to accept that there's going to have to be some retreat from the shoreline. And the problem is, as Doug, as you pointed out, a lot of these properties are the most expensive properties in town. People want to live right next to the coast. So somehow we have to discourage, over the long run, construction in these vulnerable areas. We have to find a way to acquire those properties, which of course can be prohibitively expensive. Maybe we need to wait until they're, flooded and then acquire them. But natural wetland systems do accrete. They do grow. They do try to keep up with sea level rise. And so they're doing a lot of that work for us by building biomass and so forth along the coast. And I think we're fortunate. There's a lot of areas that have been preserved. You have Salt Pond Sanctuary just behind Surf Drive, for example. So there is already some protection in place. We just want to encourage that and move towards that, as opposed to fighting the futile battle of building a lot of hard structure that isn't going to work. So, what can come out of something like this? Maybe a general strategy. What tact are you going to take? Are you going to try to armor against it, which will be costly and ineffective, or are you going to try to accept that there's going to be some changes over time? We need to put in place, bylaws that discourage construction. Certainly we don't want to further intensify construction on the coast. And we want to encourage these kinds of wetland restoration and development strategies.
I think one of the points that Doug has often made is, if we have a plan in place when things get washed out, and if the plan is there in advance, we can then move forward with that plan, as opposed to right now, if it gets washed away, the only thing we can do is to rebuild what was there. And then realize, well, what was there didn't work because it got washed away. Said, well, you don't have a choice. Without something planned in advance, you're stuck saying, well, just redo the thing that failed.
I really appreciate especially what Ken and Bob have said, because hardscapes just really aren't allowed in many circumstances right now. So not only are they, very expensive, but, we have to look at this full picture. The commission last year had a coastal protection committee that I was on that really looked at the entire Cape in terms of, whether it was beach nourishment or property rights, or, and I think it might be interesting to see if that could be put back together, because the points that Betsy is making, we did discuss, well, what's happening in Sandwich, affects Falmouth and how that happens. So I think that might be a good way to incorporate a regional approach here. It's sort of parallel to the Water Quality Coalition that the entire Cape is, looking at right now, but it has worked really well in the past. And one of the ways that I think might be important to, also obviously incorporate Tricia and Pam's view and all of the boards that everyone here represents is through this community development director. I think that when you look at community development and you're in Falmouth, by definition, you need someone who has some background experience, professional interest, whatever the level is, in problems and challenges that affect coastal communities. So, I think that, and that person can also, I think, liaison well with the regional bodies, and, would also obviously be, familiar with state and federal concerns and regulations, so that we're not, spending a lot of time on ideas that are just never going to fly. So that's I just kind of wanted to bring that segue up, so, in terms of the rest of the agenda today.
I think what would be helpful to maybe come out of something like this is what other folks have already mentioned, which is kind of a short-term, immediate, plan. And we already have, some of this has already been done. So, dredging and beach renourishment is not something brand new that we haven't done. We've done this, we know some of the concerns, we have mechanisms in place to make sure that it's done right and that the impact to the environment is minimized. But if the town can commit and has, this is all going to be an ongoing, constant process. We are going to regularly be addressing this every year, sort of every day. And so if we have that mindset, I think it addresses, and we have something that is in place, and it's a clear, it's a whatever we want to call it, strategic plan or however you call it, and it does implicate sort of all of the boards that are here and the issue that we're talking about in terms of how does building go on. So if people who are coming to this community or live in this community want to build, understand that this is a policy that the town has, and this is a regular, whatever it is, if we're always doing beach nourishment in different places, or if we're doing whatever it might be, trying to not limit sort of the natural processes of the wetlands that we know, are kind of our first line of defense for most of the properties in this town. But if we have that in place, I think it addresses some of the concerns that we know have come before Conservation Committee or ZBA or even our board about, instead of there being someone wants to build here on this piece of property, and now suddenly we're looking at how does that implicate all of these things. If there's something that's clear and delineated for individuals, I think it's easier for the town to make an argument and to defend our particular restrictions around building, and it's also easier for people who want to come here and build, whether they're individuals or in the building profession, because they're going to know this is the policy that the town has around this issue, which is going to only become more difficult as time goes on. So I hope that we create sort of a broad, again, I don't know if it's we always keep using this word strategic plan, but a policy, really broad, very clear, delineated policy about how this town is addressing coastal resiliency or the risks to our coastline, and that they will have, it'll have specific things, like on a regular basis we're doing X, Y, and Z, and on a longer term we're doing these studies so that we can see, 10 years from now, how do we shift our focus. So I just think that when you have those types of policies in place, it not only obviously affects change that you want, but it makes it clearer to folks who are trying to do business and live and plan down the line. So some of these things aren't difficult, maybe a dredge for the town and maybe regular policy of beach renourishment, and then the other things come along. But I just hope that that's where we go, so there's something outlined for individuals.
Well, just going to one of the action items on the local comprehensive plan, the last one that I think is extremely important is thoroughly review all local codes and bylaws to increase the resiliency of construction projects and lobby for changes in the state building code. And one of the things we've talked about in some of the other elements is the transfer of development rights. We really need to change that and upgrade that aspect of our zoning. So to me, that would be one of the first places to start, because we have our most expensive real estate is on the water. You're not going to tell these people they can't build there. They're just going to go put it on stilts like they have. You look along Surf Drive now, more and more houses every month, it seems, are getting lifted up. So, it's one thing for the town to abandon, which I think we should do in cases. We shouldn't be building in vulnerable areas. We should be setting the example. But we also have to give incentives to those people in the private sector that do have property that maybe they would be willing to transfer some, that development for that property in exchange for something else, so.
Yeah, and we also, I mean, it's like we're not reinventing the wheel. We also know the state, it has actually very strict policies on barrier beaches, which we're talking surf drive, we're talking Great Sibuousett Marsh area. I mean, there are certain things you can't do or precautions you have to take. And we also know where the flood zones are. So it's like we're not starting from point zero. We know where the vulnerable areas are.
Yeah.
They're mapped.
Yeah.
The question is, what policies are we going to take?
While Megan touched on dredging, and I'm curious, that's something that we could really improve immediately. What is our policy on dredging? And we have so many inlets that are barely flushing. We know that the flushing is very beneficial to water quality, and yet we have a lot of places that really need a lot of help. And I understand recently we had Perch Pond, homeowners wanted to dredge their inlet, and they were unsuccessful. I just wondered if we could talk about that a little bit, and how we could implement more dredging, or what the reason is why we don't.
Well, I mean, I can speak to that specifically, although, is that under litigation? No, I can't speak to that.
That's another problem. Another problem we have. Every time we have a problem, we can't talk about it.
I'm just going to make a general comment that, again, decisions are made and have to be made they're competing interests. And, yeah. So, again, you say improve water quality. But the fact is, getting back to Sam's point, Mother Nature creates the winds, that creates the currents that move, the sands are fluid. And so, in the old days, these ponds would have sealed off for 10 years and then reopened in a storm. And so we're artificially keeping them open. And the dredging of the ponds generally is under the Waterways Committee. And they
But
do.
that can have some unanticipated consequences. If you enlarge, for example, the Little Pond entrance, you get greater tidal range in Little Pond, and people's backyards are flooded at high tide. So
Right.
Water quality would improve, for sure.
But the ones that we've historically dredged, we know what the results of that is.
Well, they do, and they do come. I mean, there is,
When we can go.
Jen, where are you? Isn't there a
County
comprehensive
dredge that we
permit?
try to get permission to use. Sometimes it's someplace else, which is one reason why, if we want to invest in it, one place to invest with is if we had, the town had its own dredge and funded an operator for it, or however many people we need for it, we could have a lot more control as to when and if we were going to. But we would then come across some people who said, I actually don't want you to dredge. I don't care about the beach, I care about what's happening in my pond. I don't want it. And
Or
so-
my front yard.
Right.
But just on that, the county might be getting another dredge, so.
I wanted to point out that, where there's a will, there's a way. In my lifetime, I've seen Minot get totally re-engineered. Great, and we're talking about it doing another one, opening it up wider and a lot more armoring and bigger. It sounds like, because the town wants to have that, these other issues don't seem to fall in. Oh, we'll just get it done. We have a will to get that done because we need it. I'm thinking we should probably have more of a will to preserve the connections along, because we've totally re-engineered Minot so much you can't even get close to what it was, and no one seems to have a problem with that. I mean, that road used to be 20 feet further out in the water. The bridge used to be here. I mean, and there's old designs that we found where they were actually talking about moving the bridge a couple 100 yards inland and changing the road. I mean, there's been a lot of things to say we can't do that we've been doing. Minot has got piles and piles of sand that we dredge right now. We put it next to the parking lot, so if a storm comes, it protects the road. We're doing all these things on Menard Beach. It's live. You know, you could just go there and drive it. There's piles and piles and piles of dredged sand on Menard Beach right now. And we do it every year. And that preserves the road. And the road actually used to be 20 feet further into the water. So we're doing it all the time in some areas. And other areas that say, oh, we can't touch that. And I just think we got to take a different view.
Courtney?
We talk about dredging, and I'm reminded when I first moved here in 1972, my wife put a book in front of me, and it's called The Life and Death of a Salt Marsh. And there's a basic truth there, and that is that ponds, marshes, and wetlands and so forth inevitably fill in as part of the, if you look at the time geologically rather than in the next couple of years, they fill in, and they change, and they evolve. Now, if we're faced with things like sea level rise, and we want those areas to be the sponges to absorb it. And there have been a lot of comments from Sam and from Betsy and others about the laws of unintended consequences, you know, building, hard armoring, and then the other unintended consequences or the challenge is we have recommendations to get rid of the hard armoring, the groins and the things, and then we worry about property rights. And then we're faced with these challenges, and it's not just coming up with specific physical solutions, but it's also dealing with the legal, political climate. I mean, this town is wrestling with disgruntled people whose situations were, they suffer because of potential regulatory issues. And yet, we're going to have to put some of that stuff in place even more than we have now. That's a challenge. And I'm not sure there's an easy answer. But these are the things we have to wrestle with. And as Betsy said, you know, yeah, we've got a lot of areas we can identify just by looking at the maps and the floodplain things. We could see the vulnerable areas, whether it's Surf Drive or the coastline along Vineyard Sound or Woods Hole. I mean, what strategic things is the town, the village of Woods Hole and the institutions that are there doing about the fact that the predictions are that by the end of this century, the Woods Hole will be under 4 feet of water or more. You know, and some of that has to be private initiative, some of it has to be town and government, and then of course you've got regional. And I suppose by extreme you could say, well, it's worldwide because, you know, those ice caps are melting. Maybe we should have all the countries in the world build a huge wall around the Arctic, Greenland, and Antarctica. Keep the water there, and then we won't have a sea level rise. Now, I'm going by absurdity here. But what I'm trying to say is it's a huge problem that can't be isolated to just Falmouth, that's all.
Paul?
A couple of observations. One is, I think this is a great idea to have the committees together. We've talked a lot about a lot of studies and things have been done. And what happens many times is some or other issues take all the air out of the room. High school, cranberry bogs, the wind turbines and whatnot. So nobody's paying attention to these issues. And I think what I would suggest respectfully is that the Board of Selectmen set up a committee to look at coastal resiliency of the departments, as well as some of the people in the consulting and scientific community here, to pay attention to this and report periodically back and come up with some precise recommendations that we can act on. We're talking about all these different things. They all have merit. Some do, some don't. In some cases, they're better than others. But unless we set up a dedicated way of moving forward with a committee like that, I think we're just going to continue to talk about these issues and not get anything done.
So how many members of the committee?
Sorry?
How big a committee? Let's get down to, that
5.
5 person? Is it one from do we have at-large or representatives of
I
these
think there
boards?
should be some people from not these
Okay.
committees, right? From the,
Right.
for example, land acquisition is a big piece of this, ultimately. And identifying what parcels to buy and how to fund that would be pretty significant. So-
Is that 300 committee?
Well, that's what occurs to me as a likelihood.
I'm just saying I'd be happy to serve on that.
Well, if it's appointed committee by the Board of Selectmen, you can't,
Okay.
because we can't appoint, we, as the appointing authority, can't appoint ourselves to a board-created committee.
What if it's a town manager committee?
Then everything changes if it's a work.
Loophole.
What we found with the LCP committee was, it was a small committee, but we invited stakeholders in at certain points when we needed that to be discussed.
Yeah.
And we found that worked very well. And we've had one person that's been, how many years, Christiana?
Christiana, yeah.
So I think it's always open to anybody that wants to come. And I think you keep the committee to, say, 5 people, and those members can be interchanged at different times too, depending on what the issue might be at the time.
And to Bob's point, I mean, I think a committee of 5 is workable, but if then there are some sort of liaison connections made with some of the other stakeholders,
Yeah.
so that they're, I know every meeting, it's open, but sometimes that,
And we
doesn't
covered
mean
that with
anything
the-
if we're not connecting with folks and kind of saying, can you send someone, or
Right.
we'd love to hear from you. So I
And we
think
covered
that's.
that with the public comment
Yeah.
part of the meeting and of the agenda.
Just another, can I make one other point about the composition? Which is, we have a lot of superb scientific resources here. And I think we would be foolish not to include some experts from the institutions on a committee like this.
And Doug, one way around my point is, you could certainly have a selectman who is liaison to the committee. Just means they can go to every meeting, they can participate in discussion, they just wouldn't be a voting member. But
Right.
they could still certainly be very actively involved in the committee. Sam?
Yeah, I think the primary mission of this subunit is to really motivate action, to keep this issue in the radar screen, right? So that we actually have some steps that we can move forward on in sort of a tangible way and give us the opportunity to move. Because it's a difficult trade-off and with a very complex problem, but we need some group that keeps focusing back as to some logical steps that we can continue to make. Where are some big steps that we can move toward? Like financing is going to be a big challenge necessarily. It isn't going to be happening in 1 year. It may be a multi-year kind of thing, and there's the education process for the community to get buy-in from voters. But at least this committee should take on as its mission to champion steps forward that the town can make in the logical way to take those steps.
And I would see as the 5 people, I would really would want 1 person from the planning board and 1 person from the conservation commission, and then maybe 3 others that would be at large, trying to put the scientific community, trying to take advantage of the land, land ownership, and then have a member of the board that would be liaisoning with that group. Pam?
It may be an opportunity for that particular group of people to attend the commission meetings when they begin to talk about, this is not a Falmouth issue. And we could do anything and everything we choose to do here, but we're surrounded by other communities, we're surrounded by the entire Cape. So it seems to me this has to be much more than a local issue. And if we could get information and participate in other communities' processes as they go forward. And I would I don't think I'm naive, but I have to believe other communities are doing the very same thing. So, and you would probably know more about that, Sue, from the commission.
No, I'll
Let
be
me
happy
ask
to
you,
press that initiative.
Are all the towns looking at this as we are?
At the moment, I would say through the water quality initiatives. That's kind of the prism that it connects with at this point in time, which is why I think that the fairly recently dissolved coastal committee should be reinstated, and that's, I've been a member of both, and I see that they have people from the state come in to just educate people on what you can do, what's likely to be approved, what is never going to be approved, those kinds of things that are really, it's sort of a screening process. It is an interdisciplinary education process, it's a liaison process in terms of, potential MOUs with other communities. We have water quality MOUs with, with Mashpee and, we commonly, one thing the Cape does well, it works together with its communities. So I think that, in other words, I think the easiest way to do it is just reinstate the model that just was recently dissolved, and I can certainly take on that initiative.
Because then if you had representatives from, or 2 or 3 representatives from each community that fed into that commission, rather than every entity working as if it's an island of itself, which it isn't, it makes more sense to me.
Right, and either it could be a member of this community who is also the general, Cape-wide member, or it could be someone that comes in and reports. Either way it would work.
I just want to see some synergism between those entities, because I don't think working in a little cluster by ourselves is worthwhile.
Oh, it's hand in hand, I agree.
Yeah, I just want to point out the important role that Webner has been taking in actually trying to educate us on what's going on up and down the coast. And they should definitely be tapped to help bring in that kind of regional and coastal information, things that are going on, things that have happened, that have worked, things that didn't happen. They've been extremely valuable to me. I've gone to many of their sessions, the workshops, to actually get some perspective on this whole question of coastal resiliency. So they should be part of this group's resources, if you will.
So, you pointed out other cities, and I think you mentioned Boston. There's been a series of seminars over the last couple of years. It's a BU initiative, climate change in Boston. And Mayor Menino was instrumental in getting it started. But I'm sure it's easy, again, they probably have a website. But I've gone to some of the seminars about, specifically about sea level rise and what the options are and so forth. But I'm sure sort of how they approached it, and it was from an economic, a scientific viewpoint, an economic viewpoint, a social viewpoint. So it addressed all this. So I think, we could look to that as a model. They did that for the city, we can do it for the town.
Right.
So what I'm envisioning is on our February 13th meeting, the Board of Selectmen will either choose to have a board-appointed committee or a working group set up by Mr. Suso. And I'm hoping that we'd have a planning board representative and a Concom representative, depending on how we decide. I can't decide for us, but to give those committees a chance to say, get ready to send us somebody and move forward once we vote on the 13th.
Before we get off this, can I just ask Mr. Suso, have you had any progress with the vulnerability assessment with the coastal zone management? We approved that. We would go after that.
In terms of grant funding?
Right.
We don't have anything firm to report today, but we're happy to get back to the board in the near future on that.
Because I just wonder, is there anything else left for us to do as a board to make that happen? I think we've got that started, right? We were going to move to seek funding for the vulnerability assessment?
Correct. We've begun looking into that, but I don't, again, I'll be happy to report that.
Okay.
Yep, John?
If you're going to appoint a committee, while everyone is here this morning, could we have maybe like 10 action items, direction for this committee? Things that we as a group feel are the most important. They have to pursue something, not just resilience. It's a broad spectrum, but maybe we could have like 10 items that we feel are the most important to start with. Land acquisition, financing, natural protection, whatever. We've had some really good ideas here. We've got maybe 20 people here. We're only going to have 5. Maybe there could be some direction for this group to start.
Part of that has already been laid out, I think, by the local comprehensive
And I
plan
see
that the
that.
planning board has. But if there are other ideas that aren't in there, sure.
One thing to kind of join with your idea, I might suggest, is for each board to come up with those, however, each, 10, maybe there'll be some repetitive. I don't know that we, that's a short discussion. I think it's a little bit longer discussion, and I think if those items could be transmitted to the board, and maybe it's 10, maybe it's 15. I think that's a must-have. I think that's how this committee or group has to operate. I think it has to operate with a mandate from the joint boards. I'm just not sure we can do that, right this second, but
Okay.
I think that's a perfect idea.
Well, it's like a brainstorming here this morning, and anytime I've been in a brainstorming session, you put it on the board and you work your way down, so.
And I think at our meeting on February 13th, we'll have to charge this committee with some goals, so maybe just to, spend a few minutes. I do want to move on to the agenda items, but if you could spend 5 minutes saying, okay, what are some things that this group feels this committee must do?
I think we should explore the dredge idea.
Okay?
And coordinate information with when the new county dredge is also coming, because that might be it might be a more cost-effective.
I think coordinate with the county in everything
Comes
we're
with
doing,
it.
right?
I think interaction with the coastal zone management and understanding the grant process.
Okay. Yeah.
Because of my handy-dandy, get anything whenever I want it, immediate satisfaction. If you go on to US EPA Coastal Resilience, the plethora of information that's there is a bit overwhelming, like resources for resilience and adaptation in New England. I mean, there's so much information because they've been working on this for many years. And I think what really hit was Katrina. And so if you just put that in to your handy-dandy, get it all when you want it, the information is astounding. They've got people's names who are working on it, who I could probably tell you if they're still there.
Gotta get it before it's gone.
Print it out.
Well, fortunately, they copied everything, every single thing that could be copied. So we still have non-redacted information at EPA. But anyway, I mean, they have even a coastal adaptation toolkit. I just don't want to see us recreating what has been worked on for so many years and just spinning our wheels when we have resources that we can, tap into. We even have a representative at EPA from NOAA that comes down to Woods Hole all the time. Who knew?
Maybe a committee member.
I think one of the important items is, like Jim said, protecting the roadways. Whether they get elevated, whether they get moved back, or whether it's just protected from being washed away.
Okay, again, this is a list of questions.
Yes.
That could be.
How do we protect the roadways?
Do we?
Or do we?
Right.
Doug, can Pamela repeat that website?
Okay, what I put in was US EPA Coastal Resiliency, and you'll be bombarded with information.
Bob?
I think what I mentioned before about reviewing the local codes and bylaws to see what we can do.
I mean, I would just say that I think if we look at the action items, everything we've talked about comes under these action items. So I think if this board is, or committee rather, is created, and they kind of start from that perspective, because these include all the things that people have mentioned today.
Right.
So if they start from there, and perhaps that committee can come forward with their own list of sort of their, they can take from this and come forward with the way they're going to approach it. But, I mean, these actions for action items for implementation encompass everything that's been discussed here today, and really then some. So I think that's a great starting point for any committee, and then they can, when they're comprised with their various members, can really talk about maybe what their their list of priorities or how they're going to approach it.
I certainly couldn't see anything else that's been mentioned that was not on that
I think
list
it's really
somehow.
thorough. And
Just one last thing on, that really isn't listed as an action item, but building code issues also contribute to factors for coastal resiliency and where we build.
Doug, can you take a comment from the public?
Hi, Leslie Field with the Woods Hole Group. This discussion here today has been great. I'm happy to see everyone here together talking about these issues. I would urge you to review that local comprehensive plan and the recommendations that are in the draft hazard mitigation plan that's on the website, town's website. That plan identified the vulnerable infrastructure in the town. It identified priorities for making those infrastructure facilities more resilient. And it also identified town boards and committees that should be acting on those projects. So I urge the committee to get going, the subcommittee, look at those plans and pick the top ones and get going. Those CZM grant applications, they're due in June. You've got resources here in town that can help you prepare those grant applications. At our firm, we've worked for all of those towns that you talked about, Sandwich, the city of Boston. We did the modeling for that vulnerability study. You've got incredible resources in this town. Use them. Reach out to PUI, reach out to the Woods Hole Group. Let's get those grant applications in.
Megan?
I guess the one thing I would say, and it comes off of your comment, is that, so these are items for implementation. I think that this group needs to be charged with implementation, not coming up with strategies or coming up with a list of priorities, but the committee, I think, needs to be a committee of implementation. So I think their charge needs to be acting on, I mean, we don't need to come up with any more, all the things have already been done. They're out there in a million different studies. But I think that what's going to make this committee different is not that they're gathering information, but that they are acting on it. And so I think that is what will make this different.
What I would like to charge them is every
Yes.
month come back to a recommendation for the board of selectmen as to do this.
Yes,
Right.
action.
Every month.
Yes.
Now do this. And we can debate that. Courtney?
Yeah, I mean, as I look at this list of action items, which we're kind of alluded to, in a way, I almost see this committee, first job or obligation is to take these action items and divvy them up and assign homework to specific things. I mean, it's logical. For example, the first one is comprehensive wetlands restoration plan. Well, that seems to fall under the purview of the Conservation Commission. Now, so in other words, part of the job of this committee would be to assign homework to the other specific bodies which have the most relevance to these action items. And that, they gather all these proposals together, and now they have one single thing that is basically working off of this. And out of that come all the different aspects of this, and it gives us it essentially implements the action items. And I think that really should be the function of that committee, is to, assign the homework, so to speak, to the key people, because otherwise it just kind of disappears into an amorphous blob somewhere.
Okay, I think we're all on the same page. Betsy, you want to give us a wrap-up?
Yep, just to give you an idea of sort of lack of communication, this number one has already been done
Right.
by APCC. They have a restoration specialist who's gone all the town, met with Jen and me to go over all the listing vulnerable wetland, and Chuck, vulnerable wetlands, vulnerable road crossing passage. So I think probably a lot of these action items, if we get together as a group, we can say, hey, well, here we are.
Well, that's perfect. I mean, this was voted 2.5 years ago and said it should be done within the next 2 years. So, we're actually on the money of that action item was taken as proceeded. Mr. Finneran?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment where I believe that you all should be on the same page before you expand or go any further. This was alluded to by Mr. Fox in our treatment of Minot, as opposed to our treatment in Little Pond. Anybody who read the SMAS report by Brian Howes would read several times in the first few pages that if we just opened Little Pond from 10 feet to 20 feet, we could have sewered 1/3 less. We chose to completely ignore that, yet we're proposing to open up Minot an even greater distance, for an even greater waste of money, if you ask me. Little Pond had a lot more to do with a revenue stream than cleaning up a stream, and I'm sorry, that's just what I believe. Also, you're talking about using the dredge, or even purchasing a dredge. Of the 15 towns on Cape Cod, we have the most shoreline, and I think we're second from the bottom in the use of the Barnstable County dredge as it is. And there's no finer example of that than driving by the opening of Little Pond right now. After about 15 years, we did a silly little maintenance dredge that opened it up about 10 feet, and the thing's almost completely plugged up again. Little Pond is a toilet. We should flush it. We haven't. We wasted a great deal of money and inconvenienced a lot of people. As I said, I think y'all should get on the same page before you expand any further.
So we're going to move on to our next agenda item, unless someone else has something they want to comment on this one. We do have a representative from the Collins Center.
Yeah, I think Monica Lamboy and Dick Kobayashi stepped out of the room from and Brian Phelps will go get them.
We're going to take a 4-minute break while we go get them. 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
And I